My name is Miles Barth, and I'm a photographic specialist at auctions. And it's a privilege today to interview somebody who I've been watching and known for many, many years. I think it was 1988 we met at an opening he had at Stuck's Gallery. Andres Serrano is an important photographer, not so much in photography, but really he was one of a number of people who sort of created a gray area between the separation of contemporary art and photography. Andres is not considered a photographer, not by himself and not by many people in the art world. He's considered an artist. And to give you some context, people like Andreas Gorski, Richard Prince, Laurie Simmons, Cindy Sherman, Sherry Levine, Sophie Kell, Christian Boltanski, Alfredo Yar, Felix Gonzalez-Torres. These are all artists who've worked extensively or to some extent with photography, and their photography really reached a broader audience than traditional documentary or photojournalism would do, or photographers who were doing landscapes and more traditional photography that we sort of grew up with in art school and what museums had been showing through the 70s up until the mid-80s. So I want to start with putting some context into Andres' early work, how he started, and what the atmosphere of New York was like between 1985 and let's say 1990 or 1995. It's an important period because it was at a time in 1985 when the auction houses began regular auctions of photography, a time when some galleries in Soho were beginning to show artists who used the camera extensively but didn't consider themselves photographers per se. It was a time when museums, due to a lack of funding from the NEA and a number of other governmental sources, were starting to do larger shows to attract audiences. So it was an enormously important, sometimes overlooked period, but one I think that was really the beginning of the Big Bang that started to take place in the late 90s and into the years into the 2000s. So my first question really, Andres, is your feelings about that period. I mean, how you fit in, what you did in terms of gallery viewing and looking at other artists' work and how you felt they were either important or not important to your career, because it was at the time when 1986, I think, was your first one-person exhibition, followed a year later by an exhibition at Stuck's, followed a year later by another exhibition at Stuck's, and then the rest is sort of history.
I studied painting and sculpture at the Brooklyn Museum School when I was a teenager, and in '67. And so when I started to do my work, I never saw myself as a photographer because I never learned to print. I never went in a dark room. I was never engaged with photography except as a tool, and so I saw myself from the beginning, especially right after art school. I saw myself as an artist using a camera. That was my choice. Instead of using a paintbrush or something else, I chose to use the camera, but always as an artist, specifically as a conceptual artist, because my inspirations were really at the time were Marcel Duchamp and Bob Dylan. And so, I was not thinking about photography. I was thinking about being an artist. I was thinking about expressing myself, but I chose the medium of photography. And not only did I chose it, I chose to limit my work to that practice, to that art practice, but seeing it as an art practice rather than as a photographic medium. And so from the beginning, I've always seen myself as an artist with a camera. And to that extent, I realized that at the time in '85 and '86, when I was starting to look at galleries and think about placing my work out into the world, I noticed that there was the photography galleries and then the art galleries, and every now and then you'd find a gallery that sort of mixed both art, painting, sculpture with photography. And so, one of the things I felt that in order for me to get to that point, to be accepted as an artist more than as a photographer, I had to make the work a certain size. Meaning, if you see big pictures, you'll think, well, they're more like painting rather than photographs. Photographs, you thought of these small things, black and white things, colored things that you put on a wall, whereas these big pictures, we're now competing with the big boys.
Mm-hmm. And I think what happened eventually, with your work and some of the names of artists that they were able to get rid of the stigmatism of the camera. That, oh, it was made with a camera, so it's got to be a photograph. And I think what your work did was push that idea, forget the idea of what I used. It's what's in the work, not how I made it necessarily.
Of course. And now, 20, 25 years later, we're looking at the iPhone being used in a serious way by artists or photographers who want to make prints or pictures with the iPhone. And so this thing about, is it art because it came from a camera? I think that argument is long gone. But the other thing is that at the time, I think many museums also thought photographs, they're going to fade, their print, their editions, maybe they're not as collectible as other pieces. But I think this is a stigma that has also been overcome over the years, because you can't, you can't exclude Cindy Sherman just because he's taking their photographs,
right. And I think it leads to what was going on during that period, where museums and auction houses were having a lot of trouble with artists like Cindy Sherman. Who takes it? The photography department or the contemporary art department? And even in the museum world, the same thing happened at MoMA when they acquired their first Cindy Shermans. Who is that, contemporary art, or is it photography, or is it a shared art? And I think that's what I was saying about blurring those lines. And I think that's that period of the Richard Princes and Cindy Shermans and Laurie Simmons and the appropriation that was going on of imagery, photographic imagery, and pushing a lot of barriers and bounds. It was starting to be looked at by critics that were outside of photography, that really wouldn't look at photography until some of your work started to appear. And it was getting broader press, and I think that broader press just, it set a tsunami around the artwork, that there was a lot more going on than met the eye. So let's talk about some of your early work. I mean, how it developed, in terms of, I guess, Immersions is the first series that really everybody remembers best. I don't think it's better or worse than any of your other series, because I think your career speaks for itself in a larger sense of who an artist is. There's a consistency to your work that I think is extraordinary. I don't think there's very many people who've really had, from series to series, as a profound kind of effect on the audience in different ways and for different reasons. But it's your ideas that are being documented. So let's talk about how those ideas generated.
Well, the Immersions are certainly some early work, but before the Immersions, there's early work that is also, some of the images are known, such as Cabeza de Vaca, which is a cow's head. It's a close-up of the cow's head. Mm-hmm. At the time I was working with meat. Before I got into the bodily fluids, the Immersions, I was working with meat straight from the butcher. Sometimes using carcasses. I did a photograph in 1984 called Meat Weapon with a very young Lawrence Fishburne holding a piece of meat, almost like a weapon. But before that, there was even earlier work that no one's ever seen. And so my work, if you look at it, when I look at it, I see the thread. I see how one idea, one photograph led to another. And even if they didn't make sense to the audience, it made sense to me. I remember one time at Stuck's Gallery, we mentioned Stuck's, I had a photograph called Pieta, which was of a woman holding a fish, and the woman was Julie Ault, my ex-wife. She's holding a fish, and then they hung that with another piece that it was just a piece I had just made called Milk Blood. It was actually, Milk Blood is actually the first immersion. it's a photograph of a tank of milk, a tank of blood butted together, but it's very abstract. It's a reference to Mondrian actually. And I remember a friend of mine, Tom Cohen, a young painter, saying to me, Tom Cohen, saying to me, Andres, I like Julie's picture, but whose picture is that they put above your picture? It was, he didn't recognize it as my work because the shift from the pictorial, representative work that I had been doing in the early work kind of shifted abruptly when I did the Immersions. But for me, it made a lot of sense, and it was a matter of something that occurred to me at the time that got me into the Immersions. And what happened was I got a visit from Bill Olander, who was the chief curator at the New Museum at the time, and he was about to do a show called Fake with a lot of people like Alan McCullum and many artists who were very, very important, at the time, emerging artists who were, they were the art world at that time. And so even though, and it was about, Fake was about people who were approximating painting or referring to painting in some way. And even though I didn't think about my work in those terms, I didn't think it fit. His visit made me think, well, why don't I do that? Why don't I make photographs that look like paintings? And that's when Milk Blood became the first. Later Piss Pictures. Later, at first I used milk and blood. Later, I added piss to the palette. So, and that's how the Immersions, were born, out of the fact that I wanted to make abstract work using bodily fluids and works that referred to painting that looked like painting. I did a monochrome of blood. I did a monochrome of white, of milk, which is all white. That's a white picture. I did a monochrome of piss. So these were photographs that look like painting, but when you read the names, you realize these are not abstraction. This is not paint. This is blood. This is milk. This is piss.
If you hadn't called Piss Christ, but Golden Christ or Luminous Christ, or if that would have changed your idea, but it wouldn't have created the sensation it created because of that one four-letter word, piss. And I don't think that's, when you go through the rest of your later works, I don't need to know it's a portrait of Russell Simmons because it is Russell Simmons and Arthur Miller and a lot of the Nomad series. They all seem to have that painterly quality. I mean, whether it's the lighting or the texture, whatever. When you say that you were really studying painting and sculpture, I think it's easy to see that you're just bringing that kind of want and need right into photography.
Also, because of the fact that they were photographs, I felt the need to title the pictures in a way that was sort of descriptive for the audience. Sometimes the titles are literal, blood, milk, but they're sort of descriptive enough so that the audience understands a little bit about what they're looking at. In the case of Piss Christ, it was not meant as a provocation. It was not meant to be sacrilegious. It was just meant to be descriptive. It was piss. It was Christ. What else could I call it but Piss Christ? And, you have to remember that I, for a brief period in my life when I was about 19 and 20, I worked at an advertising agency, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a copywriter or an art director. And so they kind of, I was a junior copywriter, and art director. So they let me do whatever I want, But working in that agency made me realize the importance of the words and how words can affect how people look at an image, And so I think that's where my knowledge and my awareness of putting the right words with the right image comes from. And it has to be almost like a sound bite. It has to be something that you can that makes sense. I remember at the time that I did the Morgue in Paris at Van Lambert Gallery 20 years ago, someone came up to me and they said, when I look at the images of these dead people, it's one thing, but when I go close up and I read the cause of death, what they died of, it's like, wow, it's a double punch. And so, yeah, I think, I don't know if it was Marcel Duchamp who said, the audience completes the picture. But I feel like the title also completes the picture, and without the title, the picture is only half a work.
So let's talk beyond Immersions. There seems to be a bit of a break with Nomads and Klansmen, where you're going from objects to humans. And not surprising, but let's talk about how that transition happened.
Well, for me, the Morgue is also
And the Morgue.
people. You know,
Sorry.
I've never.
And I did see the show
Yeah.
in Paris, so
Yeah.
I know that work.
I've never referred to the people in the morgue as corpses, because corpse it implies a sort of inanimate object, an object. And I always felt these were people. They were still alive to me in some way. They had a presence, but portraiture has always been very important in my work. Aside from the period when I did the objects, submerged in urine and the immersions, all of those. Portraiture has always been very prominent, a very prominent aspect of my work, and I kind of use portraiture to talk about other things. In America, for instance, the body work that I did after September 11th, I chose people who were individuals, but who were also symbols in a way too. And so I use portraiture to express my view of the world sometimes. And I identify also with the people I photograph. Even with the Klan, even with the homeless, I identify with them to the extent of being an outsider. I've always felt like an outsider in my world, in the art world, in all kinds of, in everywhere, I've always felt that I'm passing through, but I'm not really a part of this. After art school, I became immersed in the world of drugs. For 10 years, or close to 8 years, I was a junkie. I sold drugs on the Lower East Side. I lived on the Lower East Side with junkies. And so, but I always had the sense of like, I'm here with you, but I'm not really one of you. I'm just passing through,
Right.
And so there's always been that sense of like, I'm passing through, even in the art world. I'm here with you, but I'm not really a part of you either.
Yeah.
I mean, people have said to me, didn't you expect Piss Christ to do what it did? And I say no. At the time that I did Piss Christ, I was completely unknown, doing except to, 6 or 7 people in New York City, And so I certainly didn't expect it to do anything. You go out there, with the expectation of no expectations, really, when you have nothing. You have no audience, you have no gallery, you have nothing. And so, the fact that it did what it did, it's almost like I feel it was an act of destiny, certainly not intended on my part. But when it happens, when something like that happens, you realize, well, it was meant to happen even if you didn't orchestrate it yourself.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the future. Let's talk about what you're working on now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm about to have a show at Varlande Gallery in Paris called Cuba. And Cuba has always been on my mind. It's been on my mind for all my life, actually. Mm-hmm. And the reason Cuba has been on my mind was because, my mother was born in Key West, Florida, but she was raised in Cuba. And she was taken to Cuba when she was still an infant, I think, and her parents were Cuban, so she was born in the U.S., but raised in Cuba. And she did not come back to the States until 1948, and when she came to New York, and she met my father, who was a merchant marine from Honduras. They got married. I was born here in New York City, and then my father left, but I stayed with my mother, and my mother spoke Spanish. She didn't, because she'd been in Cuba so long, she never learned English, and so I grew up speaking Spanish, and not only that, I grew up being very much aware of Cuba. I remember specifically. There was in the 5th grade, I believe, when the teacher asked all the kids to come up and one by one, and the teacher's asking everyone what their nationality is. And the teacher says to me, what's your nationality? And I said, well, I'm an American. I was born in New York City. He said, no, where are your parents from? I said, well, my mother was born in Key West, but she grew up in Cuba. And he said, great, Cuban. And he wrote down Cuban, you know. And then one of the kids who was in the classmates, one of my classmates, a guy by the name of Thomas the Donor, when he heard Cuban, he picked up on it, and he would tease me throughout the 50s when we were children, you know, in school, called me either Castro or Cuban. And I was horrified. This is like 1961, 62, 63. Cuba and Castro are bad words, you know, communism, Reds, you know, I don't want to be associated with that. So I was stigmatized by that from an early age, thanks to Thomas the Donor, and not trying to disassociate myself from that. So, but Cuba was always on my mind, but I didn't go to Cuba until last year. I decided, okay, I want to go to Cuba, and so to do some work in Cuba, because I don't like to travel except for work. So once I decided it was time for me to go to Cuba, it was because I wanted to go there to do some work. And so I emailed Jorge Fernandez, who is the director of the Havana Biennale, and also the director of the Wilfredo Lam Institute, and I said to him, Jorge, I know in the past you've wanted work from me, but the galleries weren't interested in sending work to Cuba. I have work in storage I can send you. You still invite me to be part of the Biennale? He said, yes, of course. So I sent work, and I was part of the Biennale, but I really went to Cuba. I went like 3 weeks after the Biennale opened, because I didn't go there for the Biennale. I went there to do my thing under the pretense of being an invited artist at the Havana Biennale.
And what was the nature of the work?
The nature of the work is very different, because I went there, and normally a lot of my work is done in the studio. Most, if not everything, is done in the studio. Even when I did the Morgue, I convert the Morgue into the studio. When I did the Klan, I had to go wherever they told me, even if it was outdoors at night in some dark, deserted park, you know, waiting for these Klansmen to appear. You know, I did that, and I would set up a studio wherever I was. And so, but in Cuba, I felt like I can't come here to Cuba and do a show or a book, because the intent was to do big work that could become a book. I can't come to Cuba and just go to a studio and stay in a studio. So when I got to Cuba, I was open for everything and anything. So I went all over the place. I did portraits of people outdoors, portraits of people in their homes, interiors. I got into the School of Medicine, where I photographed some body parts, not even dead people, they're just body parts. You know, and I did some nudes. I also did portraits of well-known people, creative people, intellectuals, and also regular people in Cuba. And so the Cuba work is very layered in that it's all over the place aesthetically, but also, more important, the one thing that it has in common is that most of the images were done with flash, even outdoors. Not only am I using flash, you know, where the assistant has to set up the lights and everything, but I'm also using film. And so there is a consistency in my work ethic. Even if the ideas and the images change, it's still consistent with what I do. But in Cuba, I was really all over the place. So Cuba is not what you normally would expect from Serrano. It's not photographs done in the studio only.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's conceptual.
It's conceptual,
you know,
absolutely.
And I think it just reinforces what you began 25, 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
Is that it's about concept, which starts in your brain and somehow manifests itself outside your body.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. It's been great.
Thank you.